I discovered the power lines running across my property on a Tuesday morning while walking my dogs through the back 40 acres of my land in Jefferson County, Colorado. The thick black cables hung between newly installed utility poles that definitely weren't there 2 weeks ago, cutting straight through the meadow where I'd been planning to build a workshop. Nobody had asked my permission. Nobody had even bothered to knock on my door. My name is David Kellerman, and I'd bought this 100-acre parcel 3 years earlier, specifically because it was remote enough to offer privacy, but close enough to Denver for reasonable access to civilization. The property had a beautiful old farmhouse, plenty of woods and rolling meadows that I'd been slowly improving. I worked remotely as a software consultant, which meant I could live basically anywhere, and I'd chosen this spot carefully. The last thing I expected was to wake up one day and find my land had been violated by some power company's infrastructure. I stood there that morning, coffee mug still in hand, staring up at the poles and lines with my 2 German shepherds, Max and Duke, sniffing around the disturbed earth at the base of the nearest pole. The installation was professional, I'd give them that. Concrete foundations, proper insulators, everything up to code from what I could see. But that wasn't the point. The point was that this was my land and nobody had asked. I pulled out my phone and called the number stenciled on the nearest pole. It took 20 minutes of navigating automated menus before I finally reached a human at Rocky Mountain Power. Yes, sir, those lines were installed as part of the Meadowbrook Heights expansion project, the customer service rep told me, her voice pleasant but unhelpful. Meadowbrook Heights. I asked, "What's that?" "It's the new development being built adjacent to your property. The HOA contracted us to run power to their community. Across my land." "Well, sir, I'm showing here that we have an easement agreement on file." "You absolutely do not have an easement agreement. This is my land, and nobody asked me about running power lines across it." There was a pause. Computer keys clicked in the background. "Sir, I'm looking at the documentation right now. The easement was granted by the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association. It's all properly filed with the county." I felt heat rising in my chest. The HOA doesn't own my land. How can they grant an easement for property they don't own? More clicking. "I understand your concern, sir. You'll need to take this up with the HOA. Our records show everything was properly authorized. I can give you their contact information." I wrote down the number she provided, thanked her through gritted teeth, and immediately dialed. This time I got through faster, but what I heard made my blood boil even more. "Meadowbrook Heights HOA, this is Patricia speaking." The voice was chipper, the kind of forced cheerfulness that immediately set me on edge. "Hi, Patricia. My name is David Kellerman, and I own the property directly adjacent to your development. I just discovered power lines running across my land, and Rocky Mountain Power told me your HOA authorized them." "Oh yes, Mr. Kellerman. I'm familiar with your property. Let me transfer you to our president, Deborah, who handled that arrangement." Before I could respond, I was listening to hold music. 3 minutes later, a new voice came on the line. "This is Deborah Manning, HOA president. How can I help you?" Deborah's voice was sharp, businesslike, with an edge that suggested she wasn't used to being questioned. I could already tell this conversation was going to be difficult. "Miss Manning, I'm David Kellerman. I own the 100 acres adjacent to your development. I just found power lines running across my property, and I was told your HOA authorized them. I need to know how you think you have the authority to do that." "Mr. Kellerman, the power lines were necessary to bring electricity to our community. The route across your property was the most direct and cost-effective option. Everything was done according to proper procedures." "Proper procedures? You don't own my land. You can't just grant easements for property you don't own." Deborah sighed, the kind of exaggerated sigh that people use when they think they're dealing with someone unreasonable. "Mr. Kellerman, when you purchased your property, there was language in the deed about utility access. We simply exercised those rights. I've read my deed front to back. There's no such language. Send me whatever document you think gives you this right." "I don't appreciate your tone, Mr. Kellerman. We're trying to build a community here, and we need everyone to be cooperative. These power lines benefit the entire area." "They don't benefit me. They cut right through where I was planning to build. And you still haven't explained how you got authority to put them there. Everything was filed with the county and approved. If you have an issue, take it up with them. We followed all the rules. I will take it up with them. And if I find out you fraudulently claimed an easement you don't have, you're going to have much bigger problems than an uncooperative neighbor." Deborah's voice went icy. "Is that a threat?" "It's a promise that I'll pursue every legal remedy available if you violated my property rights." She hung up on me. I stood there in my kitchen, phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the dial tone and feeling my jaw clench. Max whined at my feet, sensing my agitation. I reached down to pet him, trying to calm myself enough to think clearly. My next call was to the Jefferson County Recorder's office. After explaining the situation, they agreed to pull up the records and email me everything they had on file regarding easements on my property. Then, I called my real estate attorney, Marcus Webb, who'd handled my purchase 3 years ago. "David, good to hear from you," Marcus said warmly. "What's going on?" I explained the situation while pacing my kitchen. Marcus listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Okay, first things first, don't do anything rash. Let me pull the title documents and see what we're dealing with. If they fraudulently filed an easement, that's a serious matter. But we need to confirm what actually happened before we proceed." "How long will that take?" "Give me until tomorrow. I'll call the county myself, get copies of whatever was filed, and compare it to your original title documents. In the meantime, take photos of everything. Document the exact path of the power lines, measure distances, note any property damage. We might need that." I spent the rest of the afternoon doing exactly what Marcus suggested. I walked the entire length of the power line installation, taking hundreds of photos from every angle. The lines entered my property on the northwest corner, crossed roughly 300 yards of meadow, and exited on the northeast side toward the new development. 6 utility poles in total, each one sunk into my land without permission. The next morning, Marcus called back. His voice was tight with anger. "David, you're not going to believe this. The HOA filed a document claiming they had your permission to install utilities. They forged your signature." My stomach dropped. "They what?" "They submitted a notarized easement agreement with your signature on it." "Except it's not your signature. I compared it to your actual signature from the purchase documents. It's not even close." "That's fraud. That's outright fraud." "Yes, it is. And it gets better. The notary who supposedly witnessed it. Turns out she's the HOA president's sister. I checked her license. She's a notary, but there's no way she actually witnessed you sign anything because you never signed it." I sat down hard in my kitchen chair. "What do? We file a complaint with the county immediately to have the fraudulent easement vacated. Then we file a police report for fraud and forgery. This is criminal, David. After that, we send a cease and desist to both the HOA and the power company. And then, if you want, we file a civil suit for trespass, property damage, and any other damages we can prove. Do it. All of it." Marcus paused. "This is going to get expensive and time-consuming." "I don't care. Nobody gets to steal my property rights and forge my signature. Do whatever it takes. All right. I'll start the paperwork today. In the meantime, don't communicate with the HOA directly. Anything they say to you, refer them to me. Same with the power company. Over the next 2 weeks, things escalated quickly. Marcus filed all the appropriate documents and complaints. The Jefferson County Sheriff's Department opened an investigation into the forgery. The power company, upon being informed that the easement was fraudulent, immediately suspended any further work but refused to remove the existing lines until the legal situation was resolved. And then, I got my first visit from Deborah Manning in person. She showed up on a Saturday afternoon driving a white Mercedes SUV that looked like it had just rolled off the showroom floor. She was exactly what I'd imagined based on her voice. Mid-50s, perfectly coiffed blonde hair, designer sunglasses, and an expression that suggested she smelled something unpleasant. She knocked on my door with the kind of authoritative rapping that probably worked on her HOA residents, but just annoyed me. I opened the door but didn't invite her in. "Miss Manning, Mr. Kellerman, we need to talk about this situation you've created." Her tone was accusatory, like I was the one who'd done something wrong. "I didn't create any situation. You forged my signature and ran power lines across my property without permission. That's a very serious accusation. Do you have proof?" The sheriff's department seems to think there's enough proof to open a criminal investigation. So yes. Her jaw tightened. "You're making a big mistake. Do you have any idea how much it's going to cost to reroute those power lines? The HOA will have to pass those costs on to our residents." "Not my problem. You should have gotten actual permission before installing them. We tried to contact you multiple times. You never responded." "That's a lie. I never received any communication from your HOA before those lines went up." "But even if you had tried to contact me, not getting a response doesn't give you the right to forge documents." Deborah removed her sunglasses, revealing cold blue eyes. "Listen, Mr. Kellerman, I'm trying to be reasonable here. What will it take to make this go away? The lines are already up. We're willing to offer you compensation for the easement retroactively. It's too late for that. You committed fraud. There's a criminal investigation. This isn't a negotiation." "Everything's a negotiation. Name your price." I felt my temper rising. "There is no price. You broke the law. You're going to face the consequences. Now get off my property. You're making a huge mistake. Our HOA has lawyers, resources, and political connections. You're just one person. You really think you can win this fight? Get off my property." She stared at me for a long moment, then put her sunglasses back on and stalked back to her Mercedes. She slammed the door hard enough that I heard it from my porch, then peeled out down my driveway, kicking up gravel. The next week, I received a letter from the HOA's attorney threatening to sue me for interfering with their utility infrastructure and demanding I drop all complaints and legal actions. Marcus laughed when I showed it to him. "They're grasping at straws. They have no legal basis for any of this. Let them sue. It'll just add to your countersuit." But things were about to get interesting in a way I hadn't anticipated. The criminal investigation revealed that Deborah's sister, the notary, had notarized hundreds of documents over the past 3 years without actually witnessing signatures. It was a widespread pattern. The district attorney's office got involved, and suddenly this wasn't just about my property anymore. It was about systematic fraud in the notarization process. Meanwhile, I started researching the power infrastructure more carefully. Something Deborah had said stuck with me: the cost of rerouting the lines. If it was expensive to move them, what did that actually mean? How much leverage did I really have? That's when I discovered something fascinating. The power lines didn't just cross my property. The main transformer that stepped down the electricity from high voltage to residential voltage was also on my land. The concrete pad it sat on was about 40 feet from my property line, close to where the lines exited toward the development. I called Marcus immediately. The transformer is on my property too. I don't think they realized where they put it. Marcus was quiet for a moment. That's interesting. Very interesting. Let me think about this. 2 days later, he called me back with an idea that was either brilliant or crazy. David, I've been researching the situation. The way power distribution works, that transformer is essential. Without it, the entire development has no electricity. Now, the power company owns the transformer itself, but it's sitting on your land without a valid easement. Right. So here's a thought. What if you offered to solve everyone's problem? The power company wants to avoid a legal battle. The HOA is facing criminal charges and massive civil liability. What if you offered to buy the transformer and the immediate land around it, then sell it to the HOA at fair market value plus compensation for your damages? I thought about it. Keep talking. Think about it this way. You buy the transformer from the power company. They're happy because they get rid of a liability. Then you offer to sell a small parcel of your land, maybe half an acre, to the HOA. That parcel includes where the transformer sits and the path of the power lines. You sell it for fair market value plus, say, $200,000 for your trouble and damages. The HOA gets what they need, you get compensated, and everyone moves forward. What about the criminal charges? Those proceed separately. Your civil settlement doesn't affect the criminal investigation into the forgery. That's between Deborah and the DA's office. I considered it. On one hand, I wanted to make them tear down every pole and string of wire. On the other hand, Marcus was right that I could turn this situation to my advantage and still see justice served. Would the power company actually sell me a transformer? They might. Especially if the alternative is a prolonged legal battle over a trespassing easement. Let me reach out and see. Marcus contacted Rocky Mountain Power's legal department, and after some initial confusion, they agreed to a meeting. Apparently, having a private citizen own a transformer was unusual but not unheard of. There were some rural properties where individuals owned their own distribution equipment. The meeting took place at their downtown Denver office the following Thursday. I wore my best suit and brought Marcus with me. Across the table sat 2 attorneys from the power company and their regional manager, a tired-looking man named Gary Simmons. Mr. Kellerman, I'll be honest, Gary started. This situation is a mess. We relied on documentation that turned out to be fraudulent. We should have done better due diligence. But the fact remains that we've got 40 homes in that development that need power, and right now we're running temporary generators that cost us thousands of dollars per day. I understand your position, I said, but I didn't create this problem. Your company should have verified the easement before installing anything. One of the attorneys, a sharp-looking woman named Sandra, leaned forward. We acknowledge our error. What we need to know is what it'll take to move forward. Your attorney mentioned you might be interested in purchasing the transformer. I'm interested in a solution that respects my property rights and compensates me for the violation. If that means buying the transformer to facilitate a settlement, I'm willing to explore it. We spent the next 2 hours hammering out details. Rocky Mountain Power would sell me the transformer and associated equipment for $1, plus I'd assume all maintenance and liability. They'd provide technical specifications and help me understand what I was taking on. In exchange, I'd grant them the right to connect the transformer to their main transmission lines. and I'd indemnify them against any claims from the HOA or development residents related to this situation. It was a complicated arrangement, but by the end of the meeting, we had an agreement in principle. The actual sale would take a few weeks to finalize, involving inspections, paperwork, and regulatory approval. Meanwhile, the criminal investigation was moving forward. Deborah's sister had her notary license suspended and was facing charges. The DA's office was building a case against Deborah herself for conspiracy to commit fraud, and the HOA was in chaos. Several board members had resigned, not wanting to be associated with the scandal. I received a call from a man named Thomas Reed, who identified himself as the new interim HOA president. "Mr. Kellerman, I want to apologize on behalf of the Meadowbrook Heights community. What Deborah did was wrong and doesn't represent our values. We'd like to find a way to resolve this situation fairly." His voice was earnest, without the condescending edge that Deborah had carried. I decided to hear him out. "I appreciate that, Mr. Reed. My attorney and I are working on a proposal that I think could work for everyone. We're willing to listen to anything reasonable. The community is suffering without proper power, and honestly, we're all horrified by what happened. Most of us had no idea Deborah had forged anything. We thought everything was legitimate. I understand. Give me another week to finalize some details, and we'll present a proposal." The transformer purchase went through faster than expected. By the end of the month, I officially owned a $150,000 piece of electrical equipment sitting on my land. Rocky Mountain Power provided me with a crash course in transformer maintenance and safety. Though they assured me these units were designed to run for decades with minimal intervention. The weirdest part was suddenly having electrical infrastructure on my property that I was responsible for. The power company installed a meter so I could monitor the load and ensure everything was operating within parameters. They also gave me emergency contact numbers if anything went wrong. Now came the interesting part. Marcus drafted a proposal for the HOA. The deal was straightforward. I would sell them a half-acre parcel that included the transformer, the concrete pad it sat on, and the path of the existing power lines. The sale price would be based on fair market value for land in the area, which was about $30,000 per acre, so $15,000 for the half-acre, plus $200,000 in additional compensation for damages, emotional distress, time spent dealing with the situation, and legal fees. Total price, $215,000. Alternatively, I explained, I could simply shut off their power by disconnecting the transformer from their distribution lines. I owned it now. That was completely legal. Then they could spend whatever it cost to reroute everything and build a new transformer somewhere else. Industry estimates suggested that would run them at least $500,000, plus the time and hassle. Marcus and I presented the proposal at an emergency HOA meeting. The community center was packed. 40 families had moved into the development, and they all wanted answers about why their power situation was uncertain. Thomas Reed, the interim president, welcomed us professionally. "Mr. Kellerman, thank you for coming. The floor is yours." I stood up and addressed the room. Most faces looked frustrated and anxious, which I understood. They'd bought homes in good faith and now found themselves caught in a mess they didn't create. I want to start by saying that I understand most of you had nothing to do with what happened. You bought homes here expecting proper infrastructure, and you should have it. But the fact remains that your former HOA president committed fraud to install power lines on my property without permission. That's not something I can just overlook. A man in the back raised his hand. "Why not?" "The lines are already there. Just let them stay. I kept my voice calm. Would you be okay with someone running equipment through your yard without asking, without paying, after forging your signature on legal documents? I don't think anyone here would accept that on their own property. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. The man in the back looked uncomfortable but didn't argue further. I'm here tonight with a proposal that I think is fair. I recently purchased the transformer that supplies power to your community. I own it now. And I'm prepared to sell a small portion of my land to the HOA so you can have secure, permanent power infrastructure. I laid out the terms. Half an acre for $215,000. Marcus distributed copies of the proposal, which included property surveys showing exactly what land would be transferred. A woman in her 30s raised her hand. That seems like a lot of money. It's actually significantly less than it would cost to reroute the power lines and install a new transformer somewhere else, Marcus replied. Industry estimates for that work start around $500,000. Plus, this solves the problem immediately. No construction, no delays, no risk. Thomas Reed studied the documents. What about the criminal case against Deborah? That proceeds separately, I said. This is a civil settlement regarding the property issues. What happens to Deborah criminally is between her and the district attorney. The room erupted in discussion. People argued with each other, questioned the price, expressed anger at Deborah for creating this mess, and worried about what it would mean for their HOA dues. Thomas finally called for order. We need to vote on this, but first we need to understand the alternatives. Mr. Kellerman, what if we reject this proposal? I'd hoped they wouldn't ask, but I'd prepared an answer. Then I maintain ownership of the transformer and the land it sits on. Since there's no valid easement, I have the legal right to require removal of all equipment from my property. Or I can simply cut power to the development by disconnecting the transformer. Either way, you're looking at months without stable power and massive costs to build alternative infrastructure. That sounds like extortion, someone called out. Marcus stood up. It's not extortion. Mr. Kellerman is offering to sell property he legally owns at a fair price. He has no obligation to sell at all. The fact that your community needs this land doesn't change his property rights. This is how property transactions work. The debate continued for another hour. Some residents were angry at me, some were angry at Deborah, and some just wanted the problem solved. Eventually, Thomas called for a vote. The measure passed 32-8. The HOA would purchase the land for $215,000. Over the next month, we worked through the closing process. Title companies, surveys, inspections, and endless paperwork. The HOA had to take out a special assessment loan to cover the cost, which would be paid back through increased monthly dues over several years. I knew that made me unpopular with some residents, but I'd been the victim in this situation, not them. The closing took place on a Friday afternoon at a title company office in Denver. Thomas Reed signed on behalf of the HOA. I signed my portions, and money changed hands electronically. When it was done, I owned $215,000 more, and the HOA owned the half-acre parcel that secured their power supply. As we walked out of the office, Thomas pulled me aside. Mr. Kellerman, I know this wasn't easy for you, and I know some of our residents aren't happy with the cost, but I want you to know that I think you were fair. You could have made this much worse. I shook his hand. I hope your community recovers from this. Most of you are good people who got caught up in someone else's mistake. Deborah's preliminary hearing is next week, he said quietly. I've been subpoenaed to testify about HOA procedures. I think she's going to face serious charges. Good. What she did wasn't just wrong, it was criminal. People need to understand that property rights matter. The preliminary hearing was indeed the following week. Marcus and I both attended, though neither of us had to testify at that stage. The courtroom was less dramatic than TV shows make them seem. Just a lot of procedural discussion between attorneys and the judge. Deborah showed up in a conservative navy suit with her attorney, a slick-looking guy from one of Denver's big firms. She looked smaller than I remembered, less imposing. When the charges were read, conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery, and several other counts, her face remained neutral, but I saw her hands shaking slightly. The prosecution laid out their evidence: the forged signature, testimony from handwriting experts, phone records showing Deborah and her sister discussed the notarization, emails between Deborah and the power company where she claimed to have my permission. It was damning. The judge found sufficient evidence to proceed to trial and set a date for 3 months later. Deborah's bail was continued, and she walked out of the courthouse surrounded by her legal team, avoiding all eye contact. Her sister, the notary, had already taken a plea deal. She'd agreed to testify against Deborah in exchange for reduced charges, mainly because the DA's office found evidence that Deborah had pressured her into notarizing without witnessing signatures on multiple occasions. The trial itself happened in late August. Colorado summers are beautiful, and driving into Denver for the proceedings gave me time to think about how much had changed in just 6 months. My quiet rural life had been upended by someone else's arrogance and entitlement, but I'd stood up for myself and won. The trial lasted 4 days. The prosecution's case was strong. They had document experts who testified about the forged signature. They had the notary sister who broke down crying on the stand as she admitted what she'd done. And they had testimony from power company representatives who confirmed they never would have installed the lines without what they believed was proper authorization. Deborah's defense tried to argue that she'd acted in good faith, believing she had implied permission based on utility access language in some HOA governing documents. But those documents had nothing to do with my property, and the prosecution shredded that argument quickly. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. Sentencing came a month later. The judge gave Deborah 3 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after 18 months. He also ordered her to pay restitution, though since I'd already been compensated through the land sale, the restitution went to cover the county's investigation costs. As the bailiff led Deborah away, she finally looked at me. There was no remorse in her expression, just anger. She still thought she was the victim somehow, that I'd been unreasonable for standing up for my property rights. That was 18 months ago. Life has returned to normal, more or less. The half-acre I sold is now officially part of the Meadowbrook Heights development, with proper fencing around the transformer for safety. The HOA hired a management company to handle their affairs, learned from the nightmare that authoritarian leadership created, and from what I hear, the community is running smoothly. I used some of the settlement money to build the workshop I'd originally planned, just in a different spot on my property. It's a beautiful timber frame building with plenty of space for my woodworking hobby and enough room to store equipment. I also invested in better fencing along the property line with the development, not because I expected more problems, but because boundaries matter. The criminal investigation into the notary fraud revealed 17 other cases where Deborah's sister had improperly notarized documents. Some were related to HOA business, others were personal matters. Several of those cases led to civil suits that I followed from a distance. The whole scandal became a cautionary tale about the importance of proper notarization procedures, and Colorado tightened its notary regulations as a result. I occasionally see residents from Meadowbrook Heights at the local grocery store or gas station. Most avoid eye contact, probably because they associate me with higher HOA dues. A few have actually approached to thank me for not taking more draconian measures. One couple invited me to a neighborhood barbecue, which I politely declined. I'm not interested in socializing with them, not out of hostility, but because I chose my property specifically for privacy and solitude. The whole experience taught me several things. First, property rights are fundamental and worth defending, even when it's difficult and expensive. Second, there are people in this world who genuinely believe their goals and convenience justify trampling on others' rights. Deborah wasn't some cartoon villain. She was just a person who believed that getting what she wanted mattered more than following the law or respecting others. Third, the system works, eventually. It took months and cost me time, money, and stress, but the legal system ultimately recognized that what happened to me was wrong. The fraudulent easement was vacated, the criminal responsible was punished, and I was compensated for the violation of my rights. Marcus and I still laugh about the transformer sometimes. He jokes that I'm probably the only private individual in Jefferson County who owns electrical distribution equipment. I had to learn basic maintenance procedures, though Rocky Mountain Power still handles anything complex under a service agreement. The monthly monitoring is actually kind of interesting in a weird way. I can see exactly how much electricity the development is using and when peak usage occurs. There was one more unexpected benefit from the whole situation. The story got picked up by a few local news outlets and eventually some national real estate and property rights blogs. I started getting calls from other people dealing with HOA overreach and boundary disputes. I'm not a lawyer and can't give legal advice, but I've been happy to share my experience and encourage people to stand up for their rights. One guy from Montana called me last spring. His HOA was trying to force him to tear down a shed that had been on his property for 20 years, claiming it violated some new architectural guideline they'd passed. After hearing my story, he hired an attorney and fought back. Turned out the HOA's guideline was retroactively applied and unenforceable. He won, and the HOA had to pay his legal fees. Another woman from Arizona reached out through email. Her HOA was trying to fine her for painting her house a color they didn't like, even though that color was specifically listed as approved in the original covenants. She was ready to just repaint to avoid the hassle, but after reading about my case, she decided to fight. She won too, and the HOA board president, who'd been harassing her, resigned in embarrassment. These stories matter because they're about more than just property lines or paint colors. They're about whether individuals have rights that communities must respect, or whether the collective can simply override individual autonomy whenever it's convenient. I've become somewhat accidentally involved in property rights advocacy. I'm not running for office or starting an organization, but I do speak up when I see injustice. And I've learned that sometimes the best way to fight an injustice is simply to stand your ground, follow the law, and refuse to be bullied. My dogs and I still walk the property every morning. We pass by the fence line with the development, and I can see the transformer humming quietly in its enclosure on what's now HOA land. It's a reminder of everything that happened, but it's also a symbol of something important. I stood up for myself. I didn't let someone else's entitlement or fraud define what happened on my property. Would I do anything differently if I could go back? Maybe I would have checked on my land more frequently, so I would have caught the installation earlier. But in terms of how I responded, no. I'd fight the same fight again. Property rights are too important to surrender just because defending them is inconvenient. the money from the settlement has been useful. Beyond the workshop, I've invested most of it conservatively. I'm not flashy with spending, never have been. But there's a certain peace that comes from knowing I was compensated fairly for what happened. It wasn't about getting rich. It was about the principle that you can't violate someone's rights without consequences. Deborah will likely be released on parole soon, assuming she's kept clean behavior in prison. I don't wish her ill. I hope she's learned from this experience, though based on that look she gave me at sentencing, I'm not sure she has. Some people never learn that their wants don't override others' rights. The interim president, Thomas Reed, actually became the permanent president of the HOA. He ran unopposed and has, by all accounts, been doing a good job. He established transparent procedures, required multiple board members to sign off on any significant decisions, and implemented quarterly meetings where residents can voice concerns. It's what Deborah should have done from the start. There's an irony in all of this that I think about sometimes. If Deborah had simply knocked on my door before installing the power lines, we probably could have worked something out. I'm a reasonable person. I understand that utilities need to go somewhere, and I'm not opposed to easements when they're properly negotiated and compensated. But by taking the arrogant approach, by assuming she could do whatever she wanted without consequence, Deborah created a situation that cost her HOA residents far more money than a negotiated easement would have cost. She ended up in prison. Her sister lost her notary license and her reputation. And I ended up with a significant cash settlement. Pride and entitlement are expensive. Last month, I actually did accept an invitation to speak at a local community meeting about property rights and HOA governance. It wasn't the Meadowbrook Heights community, but a different development that was establishing their HOA structure and wanted to hear cautionary tales about what not to do. I stood in front of about 60 people in a community center and told my story. When I finished, the questions came fast. How did you know to fight back? How much did the legal battle cost? Would you recommend people join HOAs? What signs should people watch for that indicate an HOA is overstepping? I answered as honestly as I could. Legal battles are expensive, often costing tens of thousands of dollars. You need a good attorney and the stomach for a long fight. But some things are worth fighting for. As for whether to join HOAs, I told them that good HOAs with proper governance and respect for individual rights can be fine. The problem is that HOAs concentrate power, and power attracts people who want to wield it over others. One woman asked what I thought the core issue was. I thought about it for a moment before answering. The core issue is accountability, I said. Deborah thought she could do whatever she wanted because she was HOA president. She had a little bit of power, and she assumed that power meant she didn't have to follow rules or respect rights. She learned the hard way that everyone is accountable to the law, no matter what position they hold. After the talk, several people came up to thank me. One man shook my hand vigorously and said, "You're a hero for standing up to them." I wouldn't go that far. I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who refused to be a doormat. The technical aspects of owning a transformer are less dramatic than the legal battle, but interesting in their own way. The unit requires periodic inspection to ensure oil levels are correct, and there's no damage to the insulators or connections. Rocky Mountain Power handles most of this under our service agreement, but I've learned enough to do basic visual checks myself. There's something satisfying about understanding infrastructure that most people take for granted. Every time someone in Meadowbrook Heights turns on a light or charges their phone, electricity flows through equipment that I once owned and then sold to them on my terms. It's a small thing, but it represents something larger about property rights and negotiating from a position of strength. I've thought about writing a book about the experience, a guide for people dealing with HOA overreach or property rights violations. Marcus thinks it's a good idea and has offered to contribute a chapter on the legal aspects. I haven't committed yet, but maybe someday. For now, I'm content to share my story when asked and encourage people to stand up for themselves. The workshop is finished now, and I've been spending a lot of time there. Woodworking is meditative. There's something about working with your hands and creating something tangible that's satisfying after a career spent writing code and pushing pixels around screens. I'm currently building a dining table from reclaimed barn wood, and it's coming together beautifully. Max and Duke are getting older. Max has some arthritis in his hips, and Duke's muzzle is going gray. We still walk the property together every morning, though our pace is slower than it used to be. They've been with me through the whole drama with the HOA, offering uncomplicated companionship and loyalty. Dogs are good that way. They don't care about power lines or property disputes. They just want their breakfast and their walks and some time with their person. Looking back on everything, I'm proud of how I handled it. I didn't resort to anything illegal or unethical. I didn't sabotage the power lines or harass anyone. I simply used the legal system the way it's supposed to be used to protect rights and provide accountability. And it worked. That's the message I want people to take from this story. The system isn't perfect. It's slow and expensive and frustrating, but it works if you're willing to engage with it. Deborah bet that I wouldn't fight back, that I'd be intimidated by her position and her threats about lawyers and resources and connections. She was wrong. I think about the 40 families in Meadowbrook Heights sometimes. Most of them are good people who just wanted a nice place to live. They got caught up in this mess through no fault of their own. Part of me feels bad that they're paying higher HOA dues because of the settlement, but another part of me recognizes that's not really my responsibility. They chose to buy into a community with an HOA. Part of that choice means being subject to the decisions and actions of their elected leadership. When that leadership commits fraud, the community bears the consequences. Maybe that will make them more careful about who they elect in the future. Maybe they'll pay more attention to what their HOA board is doing. Democratic governance requires participation and oversight. When people check out and let others run things without accountability, bad things can happen. Thomas has done a good job of rebuilding trust and implementing better procedures. I've seen their meeting minutes, which are now posted publicly online. There's transparency that didn't exist under Deborah. That's progress, even if it came the hard way. Colorado weather is turning toward fall now. The aspens are starting to change color, and there's a crispness in the morning air that signals summer's end. I've lived through another season on this land that I chose carefully and fought to protect. The property looks beautiful. The meadow where the power lines cross is recovering from the disturbance, grass growing back thick and green. I've started planning for next year already. There's a section of woods I want to thin, removing some of the dead trees and creating better habitat for wildlife. There's also a pond I've been thinking about adding. Nothing huge, but enough to attract ducks and provide water for the deer that pass through. These are the kinds of decisions a property owner gets to make. These are the rights that I fought to protect. The right to decide what happens on my land, to plan improvements and changes according to my vision, not someone else's convenience. That's what the fight was really about. Not money, though the settlement was appropriate compensation. Not revenge, though seeing Deborah held accountable felt like justice. It was about the fundamental principle that my property is mine, and nobody gets to take that away through fraud or intimidation or assumed authority. Would I recommend that others fight similar battles? That's complicated. Every situation is different, and not everyone has the resources or temperament for extended legal conflicts. But I would say this: know your rights, document everything, get good legal advice early, and don't be afraid to stand up for yourself. The cost of defending your rights might be high, but the cost of surrendering them is higher. Once you let someone take a little, they'll keep taking. Boundaries matter, both literal property boundaries and metaphorical ones about what you'll accept. Marcus jokes that I should put up a sign at the entrance to my property. Trespassers will be vigorously prosecuted, property rights enforced, HOAs not welcome. I laugh, but I'm not actually that hostile. I just want to be left alone to enjoy what I worked hard to purchase and maintain. The legal world has moved on to other cases. Marcus stays busy with various clients and their property disputes. The DA's office is prosecuting other crimes. Rocky Mountain Power is running lines to new developments, hopefully with better due diligence now. And life continues. But for a moment in time, my case mattered. It stood for the proposition that individuals have rights that even organizations must respect. It proved that fraud has consequences. And it showed that sometimes standing your ground is exactly the right thing to do, even when it's difficult. I hope Deborah learned something in prison. I hope she emerged understanding that other people's rights are as important as her goals. But honestly, that's her journey, not mine. I've moved on. The transformer hums quietly in its enclosure on what's now HOA land, converting high-voltage electricity to usable power for 40 homes. It's properly maintained, properly secured, and properly owned. The way it should have been from the start, if anyone had bothered to do things right. Every time I walk past that property line, I'm reminded of what I learned. Vigilance matters, rights must be defended, and nobody has the authority to violate your property simply because it's convenient for them. These are lessons that apply far beyond real estate disputes. They're principles for how we treat each other and how we structure our communities. As I write this, sitting in my workshop with Duke asleep at my feet and Max stretched out in a patch of sunlight, I feel content. My property is secure. My rights were defended. Justice was served. And I have a story that apparently helps others facing similar situations. That's enough. That's everything, really. I didn't set out to become some advocate for property rights or cautionary tale about HOA overreach. I just wanted to build a workshop on my own land. But when someone threatened that simple desire through fraud and arrogance, I stood up, and I'd do it again.